I'm joined again tonight by Dr. E. Michael Jones. Dr. Jones is a historian, a researcher, and a prolific writer. His books include Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation and Political Control, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit and Its Impact on World History, The Slaughter of Cities, Urban Renewal as Ethnic Cleansing, and the most recent, Barren Metal, A History of Capitalism as a Conflict Between Labor and Usury. Dr. Jones also publishes Culture Wars magazine. His books and a subscription to Culture Wars can be purchased at culturewars.com. You want anything to add to that intro? Any more info? Or
No, that's pretty much it.
Oh, good. Okay. Tonight, I wanted to talk to you about neoconservatism and their rise to power and virtual takeover of U.S. foreign policy in the 70s and 80s. Neoconservatism. What is neoconservatism? Who are they?
The father of neoconservatism was Irving Kristol. Irving Kristol was a Trotskyite during the 1930s. They went to a lot of, most Jews were communist in the 1930s. Most Jews lived in New York City at that time. Most of the Jews at that point a lot of Jews went to City College in New York. And we have the famous story of Alcove A at the lunchroom there, which was the Stalinists, and Alcove B were the Trotskyites. And Irving Kristol was part of Alcove B and the Trotskyites. And so our story begins pretty much in the 1970s. Irving Kristol said that a neoconservative was a liberal who had been mugged by reality. This is all pure window dressing and obfuscation. That's not really what was going on here. Irving Kristol and the neoconservatives remained Trotskyites from beginning to end. All they did was redefine the class involved. It went from being the working class to the middle class, and the class involved in class warfare, and also the country involved. And so in the 1930s, the Soviet Union was the vehicle of the Jewish revolutionary spirit, but by the 1970s, beginning in the 1970s, the United States took over that role. It was the cutting edge of the Jewish revolutionary spirit in the world, where it stands pretty much today. So in order to get situated, we have to, I think, go to the crisis of the 1970s. We had Watergate, and then following Watergate, which was a coup d'etat that got rid of Richard Nixon, we also had the Church hearings, which took place in 1976, named after Senator Frank Church of Idaho. And during this period of time, we also had the end of the fall of Vietnam. And so we had a widespread sense of disillusionment in the country, and a widespread sense that somehow America's foreign policy had gotten out of control, specifically because of the CIA. So as a result of the Church hearings, these exposed Operation Phoenix in Vietnam. They exposed a lot of the internal meddling. The FBI's COINTELPRO program got exposed during this period of time. And so Jimmy Carter decided to capitalize on this and make it the issue of his presidential campaign. And it succeeded. He got elected, was elected in 1976. And in 1977, he decided that he's going to clean house. He appoints his naval buddy, Admiral Stansfield Turner, as head of the CIA. And in November of 1977, Admiral Turner perpetrates what came to be known as the Halloween Massacre, the Carter administration's attempt to bring the CIA under control. The result of this was anywhere between 800 and 2,000 rogue CIA agents, also known as cowboys, were basically fired by Admiral Turner. And the budget was cut, and they were forbidden to engage in assassinations as part of their covert operations. So a period of what some would call demoralization set in the CIA. They didn't know what to do at this point, and so the foreign operatives then took over a group called the Safari Club, which was basically where they met in Kenya, Anwar Sadat, the Shah of Iran, other people I don't remember at this time. Saudi Arabia, of course, the most important. Decided to take up the slack that the CIA couldn't do, and so they became involved in covert operations, funding covert operations that the CIA could not fund at that point. It is at this point also because of the lack of funds that the CIA got involved once again in criminal activity in drug production. They lost their drug laboratory in Southeast Asia in the Golden Triangle with the fall of Vietnam. And at this point, Afghanistan became very important to the CIA because poppies grow in Afghanistan, and it became one of the major sources of the heroin production in the world. So Bush, George H.W. Bush, is one of the cowboys, and he's out of power. And so what he tries to do is basically regroup his forces, get those people together now, and work for the overthrow of Jimmy Carter. A vendetta against Jimmy Carter emerged, involving the CIA. Part of this vendetta against the remaining CIA was a plan to undermine all of the CIA's intelligence reports. The history of post-World War II America, also known as the Cold War, is the history of peace threatening to break out and people rushing to make sure that doesn't happen. I am convinced that John F. Kennedy was assassinated by the CIA and other people to prevent an agreement that he was going to arrange with Nikita Khrushchev to end the Cold War. I think that's one of the main reasons he was killed. Other people were involved, but that was one of the reasons. At this period of time, we have the same type of thing. The CIA, the cowboys have lost their jobs. They need to regenerate the CIA. They need to put it back on the cutting edge. And so they need a threat. And the CIA at this point, the people who are left, who are doing the real intelligence reports, are simply saying, no, there's no threat. They're not a threat. They're not. And so what George Bush arranged at this point was he wanted another opinion. And the name of the group that was to give him the other opinion was called Team B. And Team B were the Neoconservatives under the direction of Richard Pipes, the Harvard professor. And they came up with a statement that was a preposterous exaggeration of the Soviet military threat at the time, which would regenerate interest in refunding the CIA and kind of restart the Cold War, because the Cold War was starting to sputter out under Jimmy Carter.
This is the era of détente, right?
Pardon me?
This is the era of détente.
Well, détente was always Kissinger was still around. Détente was basically Kissinger's idea. Mm-hmm. And he was the Secretary of State under Nixon. And Henry Kissinger was the enemy to the Jews who were the neoconservatives, because he accepted coexistence and this type of thing. And they wanted to defeat the communists. They wanted basically, they knew that all of their money was going to be cut if they couldn't show that there was some type of plausible threat. And so this is where the Jews, the neoconservatives, the former Trotskyites, the students of Leo Strauss at the University of Chicago, people like Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz, got their foothold in the government by becoming part of Team B and saying there was this tremendous threat to the security of the United States. That's how they got in. They all congregated under Henry Scoop Jackson, the senator from Washington. They worked for him. And this was, as I said, their beachhead in power in Washington. This was their beachhead. So basically what happened here is that Bush, let's back up here. We're talking about, so that was November of 1977, the Halloween massacre. We have 78, which is basically there's kind of upheaval in Afghanistan. There's a coup d'etat in Afghanistan. The Soviets, the Dowd is removed. Taraki comes in, who is a Soviet operative, and he starts basically a campaign to bring about the Sovietization of Afghanistan. Tremendously misconceived plan of basically forcing these herdsmen, these mountain herdsmen, into schools, forcing feminism on the girls, forcing all kinds of other stuff that the Muslims of Afghanistan, these tribes, found totally repugnant, and forcing it down their throats with the support of the Soviet Union leadership, which is at this point old. One of the curious facts about the Soviet Union is that it really had the lifespan of a man, and it never regenerated itself. It got old. So there were 20-year-olds in the 20s, and there were 70-year-olds in the 70s, and that was it.
Yeah.
You know, and so these people just were incapable. The Brezhnev era was the last kind of era of the Soviet Union. He died, and then he's replaced by a bunch of apparatchiks who were all older than he was, and all stuck in the same mode. And so basically they're looking with greater and greater consternation at the situation in Afghanistan, and they're wondering what to do. They don't like Taraki. There's a coup. He overthrows the other guy. I forget the other guy's name. Then he's in power. Then the Soviet Union decides they don't like him. And the CIA is aware that this is happening, you know. And there are people like Zbig Brzezinski, who has always been the godfather of democratic foreign policy initiatives, and he's itching for revenge for Vietnam. So we have this convergence of forces here. At the same time, also the campaign of revolution in Europe is spinning to its conclusion. Also back in 1977, let's go back to 68. The revolution in Paris. The Jews want to overthrow de Gaulle. They're unhappy with de Gaulle. They don't like the idea. And so therefore we have people like Daniel Cohn-Bendit as the leader of the student revolution of 68, which almost topples de Gaulle but does not. So we have the emergence of the radical left in France at this time. They reach a crucial crossroads, I think, in around 1975, where they have to make a choice. They are Maoists, and the question is, are we going for terrorism? And they can't bring themselves to get involved in terrorism. I don't know what it is, but they just can't do it. At that point, the leadership of the revolutionary movement in Europe passes to the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany. In 1972, the Baader-Meinhof gang had an alliance with El Fatah, were involved in the Munich massacre. At that point, the leadership of the Baader-Meinhof gang was captured end of 72. By 74, 75, it's pretty clear that they are still running their operation, even though they're in prison because of lawyers smuggling in guns, people like Horst Mahler, Klaus Croissant, the Frenchman. They're still running their operation, so it comes down to a crucial moment in 77. Their Palestinian friends hijack the Landeshut, the airplane, fly it to Entebbe. Do I have this right now? Or no, this is Somalia, I believe. This plane goes to Somalia. The Germans send in their SWAT team, and basically the terrorists are killed, and the plane is free. So that doesn't spring the Baader-Meinhof gang. They have also captured Hans-Martin Schleyer, who is the head of basically the German Employers Association, and they're holding him hostage. At this point, so we have a quick chain of events. The Landeshut attempt to free the Baader-Meinhof gang fails. At this point, Baader, Enslin, and Meinhof commit suicide. At this point, the other Baader-Meinhof group that has Hans Martin Schleyer as a hostage, murders Schleyer. So we are now at the brink of war. It looks as if the Baader-Meinhof gang is coming close to toppling the government. And at this point, I think the German left looks into the abyss, what could have been just ongoing terrorism of the kind we have in the Middle East, chronic terrorism of the sort that ISIS is perpetuating now, for example. And maybe it's because they're fundamentally still Christian there or whatever, but they take a step back and they can't do it. They can't do it. And at this point, I think the left, the great body of people, the student left, my generation, the baby boomers in Germany, who had a lot of sympathy for the Baader-Meinhof gang and sympathy even for their terrorist acts, I think they back off. And at that point, one of the significant events is January of 78. There's a Congress in Berlin called the Tunix Congress. Tunix it sounds like Tunisia, except that it means tu nix, which means do nothing. So a kind of apathy and lethargy and pacifism settled into the left at this point, and they basically just broke up. It just broke up. There were some people who were still involved in the Baader-Meinhof gang. Whether they were really involved is a question that still has not been answered. So, for example, in 1989, the head of the Deutsche Bank, Alfred Herrhausen, was assassinated. It's not clear that the Baader-Meinhof gang did it. I suspect that it was the German government murdered the guy. It was a Gladio type of operation, because this guy was talking about forgiving debt, and bankers who forgive debts are traitors to their class, and this is what happened to them.
I was thinking that with Baader, because there's been some speculation about the true nature of Baader-Meinhof. Was it a Gladio type creation where,
or
asset,
and which Baader-Meinhof gang are we talking about? By 1989, Baader and Ensslin and Meinhof and those people had been dead for 12 years.
Yeah.
So it's not clear. And then there are documentaries you can watch, Black Box, for example, one of the German documentaries. And there's pretty clear that I think that the guy that they shot on the railroad station and claimed that he was involved, I think he was a fall guy. It's not clear to me that he was anyway involved in this thing. So anyway, this is the kind of situation you have here. And at this point, the cowboys step up to the plate. They see their moment of opportunity. Now, Zbigniew Brzezinski gave an interview to a French paper not too long ago in which he talked about how the United States, lured the Soviets into Afghanistan. So it was pretty clear that that's what they wanted to do. They wanted revenge for Vietnam, and they thought they had a good chance of creating their Vietnam, the Vietnam for the Soviets in Afghanistan. And I think they were right.
That was in the summer of '79, I think, when he
we're talking about the summer of '79 when they met and discussed this. And at this point, Carter started approving covert aid. The president had to approve it now specifically. And Carter showed himself to be kind of feckless here. Let's face it, he did not have the courage of his convictions. If you'd taken these CIA agents and shot them, line them up against the wall and shoot them, something like that might have been different. But basically just firing them, and then they all go and they congregate, and now they're out for blood. They're out for Jimmy Carter's blood.
Yeah.
So basically what you're seeing here is that George H.W. starts conniving with the Ayatollah Khomeini.
It's important to mention here that George H.W. Bush was a director for a little less than a year, appointed by Ford to succeed Colby, right? Then Carter refused to reappoint him.
Ford felt that he was vulnerable on the right, and so he wanted to bring in the Neoconservatives.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it was, and that's George Bush was the guy who could marshal them and bring them in, and that's where Team B came about, and that's how they got their beachhead in Washington at that point.
And all the increased defense spending funds their think tanks indirectly.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes. Well, they
there's a
also took over private foundations. So basically, during the course of the 80s, Irving Kristol took over Bradley Foundation. And there was a man who was the head of the Bradley Foundation. They just did a book on him, and I forget his name. But anyway, this was to fund all of these neoconservative operations. You know, like Crisis Magazine, for example, which I think is defunct. No, maybe still exists as a online. It's been taken over. Anyway, when Dale Hudson went up in flames, the magazine pretty much ceased to exist. But it was created by Bradley Foundation, neocon money, to basically undermine the Catholic Church. And I am, in my, in all humility, undermine me, okay? Because Crisis was, it was called Catholicism in Crisis. It came into existence 1 year after Fidelity. I knew the guy, Ralph McInerney, who was the editor and founder. Michael Novak was also involved. And it was neocon money. I mean, Ralph is dead. He's gone to his reward. I always liked Ralph personally. But he once told me that he got a call in the middle of the night, and it's Michael Novak, and you can see the sweat pouring down his face, even though it's over the phone. And Michael Novak says to Ralph over the phone, "Norman's upset."
Norman Podhoretz?
Norman Podhoretz is upset. Well, I mean, what worse news could you get if you're a neocon Catholic operation than your Jewish godfather is upset? You know, and may threaten to pull the funding. He controls the Bradley Foundation now through his proxy, whoever the guy's name is, I forget. So anyway, that's sort of what Crisis was. That was that kind of money going into those people, to those people.
That magazine, you say, was sort of, I would say, was theologically orthodox, but was interventionist neocon in its policy prescriptions, if I recall. Would you describe it?
That's not how I would describe
Okay.
it, but you know, you can describe it however you want.
Okay.
I think it was just a front.
Okay.
The Jews in the 1930s were masters at creating front groups. The communists were masters at this. The neoconservatives simply did it on the other side of the political spectrum in the 70s and 80s. And nothing changed. Nothing of essence changed.
That'll explain why Michael Novak was awarded the Templeton Prize, all that money, right?
Yeah, and also why he would write The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism while employed by the Jews at the American Enterprise Institute. Mm-hmm. That is nothing but a pathetic attempt to overturn Catholic social teaching. Which succeeded in places like Poland and probably still has some impact. They still have those seminars in Poland. George Weigel has kind of taken over his role in that regard. So we have 1979, and I think we have, well, let's say late 78, the demonstrations in Tehran are getting more and more insistent, and they're getting bloodier by the moment. The Ayatollah Khomeini absolutely hates Jimmy Carter. And so the Bush wants to be president, and he's going to use his CIA cowboys to get him elected president. But, you know, it's not in the cards. And so as 79 turns into 80, it looks as if Ronald Reagan's going to be the guy. But George Bush, he's not the bag man. I forget, was it Colby? Anyway, the CIA, some guy in the CIA was the bag man, delivered a couple $1 million to the Ayatollah's people.
Was it Casey?
Casey, I think it was. Yeah.
Oh, Casey. Yeah.
Anyway, I think it's $24 million. This is I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back chronologically. Okay, February of 1979, the Ayatollah returns to power, comes to power in Tehran. 3 million people show up at the airport. He drives down the main road there in his Chevy pickup truck with people all over him, and institutes basically an Islamic republic, which is interesting from the point of view of what Freud would call the return of the repressed. Because at the very moment that the Catholic Church is abandoning its traditional teaching on the relationship between church and state, namely that the church is the soul to the body of the state, and they're adopting the views of John Courtney Murray and de facto separation of church and state, baptizing separation of church and state, the repressed returns in Iran. Because they understand that separation of church and state is a sign of decadence. And we, I think, as Americans, have to admit that they were right, that this system has failed utterly and completely. So, in the vacuum that followed Vatican II, the Catholic Church basically signed on to the American agreement of the American understanding of church and state, largely because of John Courtney Murray, largely because of the Cold War and their participation in the anti-communist crusade. And the result has been an unmitigated disaster for the Catholic Church. The most recent outrage being day before yesterday, the Supreme Court ratifying gay marriage. A system totally out of control because the Catholic Church has withdrawn from saying that it has a right to determine the moral order, to stand up for the moral order as the basis for the social order. So that's collapsed completely at this time. So the Ayatollah then reinstitutes it in 79. And you find all these lefties like Michel Foucault shows up in Tehran thinking this is the revolution. He showed up there in 78, wrote reports on it for the one of the Italian papers, Corriere della Sera. And he felt that finally, after 10 years, the worldwide revolution that he had been waiting for arrived. Well, sorry, Michel, it was the exact opposite of what you thought it was going to be. Foucault was a homosexual, a sadomasochist, and he wrote books about torture and executions. He loved blood and gore. And there was a lot of blood and gore going on in the streets of Tehran at this time, and he loved it. And he thought this was going to be the real revolution of the Marquis de Sade. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't. It was the return of the moral order in Islam through the Velayat-i Faqih, the rule of the guardians. So at this point, the Shah needs a place to live. He's dying of cancer. Jimmy Carter allows him to come to the United States. At that point, the Iranian students storm the embassy in Tehran, take over the embassy, and hold 150 some Americans hostage. This is in November of 1979. 1 month later, perhaps sensing a sense of opportunity, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Throughout the course of the 1980s, as I said, a little bit getting ahead of myself, the George H.W. Bush, Bill Casey, all these people were basically they gave money to the Ayatollah, $24 million, I believe, so that he would extend the hostage crisis. I read the memoir of Masame Takiba, I believe that's her name. She was the spokesman. She spoke English. She lived in Philadelphia for a while with her parents, learned perfect English, and then was the spokesman for the students during the hostage crisis. She said in her memoir that it was supposed to last 3 days. That's what they thought. Just to make a point, it was going to last 3 days. And then she didn't know why it was lasting so long. And she said, well, there are people who say the Ayatollah may have collaborated here. I don't know. Basically, she's admitting that it probably was true. We know it was true now. So the Ayatollah is collaborating with the CIA here at this point to drive Jimmy Carter from office, which happens. And then there's that great moment when Ronald Reagan gives his inaugural address and he says, free those hostages. And within 15 minutes, they were free. As if he had some type, what power this man had. How did he do that from all the way over there?
And so yeah, Robert Perry and also Barbara Honegger has detailed that in their books. And the money transfers, the arms shipments, and so all the mechanics, all the details of the deal are there. Just the explanation hasn't been provided. Yeah. But you can put two and two together. Yeah, what's going on there?
So at this point, the Americans promise we'll never interfere in your internal affairs again. Well, that wasn't even worth the paper it was written on, because within 1 year they had goaded Saddam Hussein into attacking Iran, and as revenge for the hostage crisis, and as revenge for losing that. But the important thing, from our perspective, was the war in Afghanistan. Because at this point, the CIA now, with Reagan in power, all bets were, there were no, the rogue CIA is back in power. And you can read, there's a fictional account, sort of fictional account, Charlie Wilson's War, starring Tom Hanks, a totally loathsome politician by the name of Charlie Wilson from Texas, a total pawn of the Jews, got arrested. It's hard to believe, but he's arrested for drunken driving, hit and run driving, dead drunk, which he was most of the time, and within weeks of the election. Well, he's toast, right? Well, no. Ed Koch gets his Jewish buddies together in New York City. They raise $100,000, and everybody knows our system is $1, one vote, and so he's reelected. And now that he's reelected, he's one more stooge for Israel involved in this thing. But his great cause, he had falling out with Israel. He understood what they were doing. He didn't like it. There was still some humanity left in this guy in spite of all the stuff, all of his drinking. But what you have here now is the great Holy Crusade. The CIA comes back with a vengeance now. They are the funneling arms to the Mujahideen, the holy warriors in Afghanistan. And basically what you saw at this point was that the entire Islamic world was called upon to move in, go to Afghanistan. Actually, they had to go to Pakistan first, go to Peshawar and meet with the ISI. And the ISI, which is the Pakistani intelligence group, is coordinating things with the CIA, and we'll arm you and we'll send you in there to fight godless Soviet materialism. Now, at the same time, again, to get back to 1979, June of 1979, Pope John Paul II arrives in Warsaw and says Mass at Liberty Square there in Warsaw in front of 1 million Poles in what is still officially an atheistic, communistic country. So you have in 1979 this movement of history, I think the genuine world spirit, what Hegel would call the zeitgeist, moving history, and a revulsion against materialism, the 19th century ideology that spawned both Soviet communism and also American imperialism. Both two sides of the same evil coin, as far as I can tell. And the difference being that the Pope John Paul II, was avid to become involved in the anti-communist crusade, to restart it after Paul VI got disgusted with the Americans, got disgusted with their double dealing, and created Ostpolitik, which corresponded to détente with Henry Kissinger, and so on and so forth. Well, now we're going to show those commies, and now we have the Pope on board. And so this is where we get into the things that you were mentioning, Te Due, the Masonic Lodge. The Vatican Bank is now getting money from the CIA, and they're laundering money so that they can bring down communism, so that we can get fax machines into Solidarity, the union in Gdańsk and Poland. And the church has been paying the price ever since. This is what happens when you get worldly ambitions. And I hate to say this about a guy who's now a saint, but I think he had worldly ambitions that were going to have significant blowback for the Catholic Church, and is still having blowback.
It's one of those
Catholic Church.
It's one of those bad deals the church has historically made throughout history.
Well, the church is always feeling we can't survive unless we have France protecting us, or Spain protecting us, or we can't survive without the Roman Empire protecting us from barbarians, and they're always wrong. And so now, after World War II, is the church saying, well, we can't survive against the communists unless we have the United States protecting us. Well, we now know that the United States was every bit as much the enemy of the Catholic Church as the Soviet Union was, and worse because they were subtler.
And of course, if you look deeper into history, you find that Marxism, communism was financed by Wall Street.
Right.
So
there's a Jewish connection because you've always got some rich Jew like James Rothschild willing to fund some Jewish revolutionary like Heinrich Heine. That's what Balzac said. Saw the two of them walking down the streets of Paris, arm in arm. He said, "Voila, tout l'esprit juif."
And of course, Zionism, which Rothschild, I guess, began to back in the late 19th century, the House of Rothschild, as it became a kind of a tangible movement in the late 19th century. I was watching a documentary on Queen Victoria on PBS, and this episode was dealing with the British purchase of the Suez Canal.
Yes.
And it had a situation where, of course, Benjamin Disraeli was the prime minister at the time, and he couldn't get Parliament, wasn't in session, nor would he think he could get Parliament to pass a bill to buy the shares in the Suez Canal. So he approached Lionel de Rothschild and got him to loan him £4 million for the purchase. And apparently, this was said. Lionel Rothschild asked him, "What collateral do you have?" And he said, "The British state."
Yep. Well,
And-
they need no. This
Yeah.
is true because
Yeah.
the Rothschilds needed not so much the British state as the British Navy.
hmm
And so you have, for example, the Don Pacifico affair in the middle of the 19th century, where Palmerston orders British warships they're going to fire on Athens because some Jew claims that they stiffed him and they wouldn't pay off his debts. So the Rothschilds needed what is the name for the British Navy? What's the name that Hobbes gave it? Leviathan. England is a sea monster.
But that's that model for more or less these bankers or rich bankers socializing their risk and privatizing the profit, keeping
Right.
the profits.
So the Rothschilds were always big proponents of a big navy. And Winston Churchill, when he was Lord of the Admiralty, was their pawn.
And they wrap it in the flag, right?
Yes.
They wrap their interest in the flag,
Yes.
and then it's the
Yes.
it's
Well,
the
but guess what?
Yeah.
Guess what the Jews did here? Same thing.
Mhm.
You know, like American patriotism is now bound up with defending the state of Israel. Well, they talk about daylight, no daylight, or John McCain sees daylight here because Obama wants to deal with Iran. This is the type of situation we have inherited from the Jews, the neoconservatives, and their legacy in the British Empire. So we've got a situation where now the church is involved with the anti-communist crusade, and the United States has created, once again, they've created a monster, and this monster is the Mujahideen. And the guy who's the poster boy for this effort is none other than Osama bin Laden, who flew there, was a Saudi whose father was a very rich contractor, flew to Afghanistan and became the conduit for all of this money and military aid going into the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. He became a rich sheikh. He became a provider for these people. And basically, he also became a vehicle for training all of these Muslims in the most radical and nihilistic, I would say, form of Islam, namely Wahhabism.
That was funded by the CIA.
No, that was not funded by the CIA. That was funded by the Saudis, who at this point, you remember the oil crisis. The Saudis had so much money in 1974, they didn't know what to do with it. And so they started buying British arms, and the British got involved, and the Americans took that over. And they started funding madrasas all over, building mosques all over the place to promote their kind of weird form of Islam. Very different than the Shia form in Iran.
And at this time, the Bin Laden family, aren't they also business partners with the Bush family?
The Bush family is heavily involved in
Carlyle Group and all that.
Yeah, the Carlyle Group. There are pictures. You can Google the pictures of George H.W. Bush walking hand in hand with Prince Saud or whoever he is at that time. Anyway, yeah, they're a very close relationship, which also played a crucial role in 9/11, by the way. But again, we're getting ahead here because what you've done here is you created a monster, and the monster is now this group of Islamic fanatics who succeed in driving the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. And then the story is, well, now what? What do we do now? Liddell Hart wrote a book called Strategy about irregular warfare, and he says it's always a bad idea. It always backfires. It always creates more problems than it solves because you're always attracting criminals. They're the people that want to get involved in this thing. And this is precisely what you see now in Iraq. ISIS, they're criminals. They're murderers, criminals, rapists, you name it. They do it. And these are the direct descendants of the Mujahideen. In other words, you create this monster and it morphs and it doesn't die. You've got what now the CIA would call a disposal problem. What do you do with these people? They're real human beings, and so they go to Somalia after they leave. Osama bin Laden goes to Somalia, and you end up with Black Hawk Down and Mogadishu. You know, the United States wants to intervene in what they call a humanitarian effort, and you can watch the movie. Ridley Scott did the movie. Graphic pictures of those helicopters flying into Mogadishu and getting taken out by RPGs. They realized the technique of taking down helicopters by firing an RPG at the rear rotor came about in Afghanistan. It was one of the standard techniques of taking down Soviet, and here it's now taking out American helicopters in Somalia. It's classic blowback, because the Americans are too stupid to realize that these people have a mind of their own, and they hate America. America, the one thing that unites the Islamic world, which would unite people, the Saudis and the people like Osama and the Shia, is the notion that America is the great Satan. So they came out of Afghanistan energized. They came out thinking we are the ones, the Mujahideen are the ones who defeated communism, and now we're going to go after the other Satan, the other materialist power. We're going to go after America. And so Somalia, Black Hawk Down, that's the first instance. And you've got this group of people that are causing trouble wherever they are. They're in North Africa. They eventually end up in Libya. And this is one of the most shameful incidents in recent U.S. diplomatic history. Hillary Clinton's shameful performance in Libya, where she basically used this group of people, this Frankenstein monster, to destroy Gaddafi and enable the looting of Libya. The gold is stolen, the water is stolen, the oil is stolen, the country is in complete anarchy. And then that group of people, she's arranging with the ambassador to send this group of people and their weapons to Syria. And that's when the ambassador got killed. And that was on Hillary Clinton's watch. And how anybody could vote for someone like this after this debacle in foreign policy is beyond me. But that's what happened. So here you have the whole story. Syria is supposed to fall. Every week during, 2013, 12, 13, every newscast, every night is that what's his name now? I forgot. Assad. Assad is on his last legs. The freedom fighters are fighting. Any corpse you find in the street. You know, the guy could have been run over by a truck, but the camera will zero in. And here's another example of Assad killing his own people. Pure, unadulterated propaganda. And it didn't work. And so what you have now is this group of people. Now they're back in Syria again. They just attacked that Kobani. They just are back attacking Syria again. So a total monster, the fruit of this evil CIA cabal to overthrow communism, totally out of control. Nobody knows what to do about it.
So all this mayhem they're stirring, all the trouble, the mayhem that they're stirring up with these proxy forces, it may be awful for the people on the ground and ultimately bad deal for the American people, but it does serve the interest of a narrow few in the military industrial complex and national security state, and namely Israel. Because Israel has a long-term objective of destabilizing its neighbors, correct? I mean,
that's right. There are some people who say that Israel is the main sponsor of ISIS, but that the main goal here is anarchy. Israel loves it. The Jews love it when their neighbors are weak, when everyone's weak but them. And I think that's what's happening. And that you see, so now they're perfectly happy with complete monsters like ISIS the only people who are fighting ISIS on the ground are the Iranian militias. And who is Israel concerned about? It's Iran. Well, this is preposterous. Even more preposterous was this ridiculous speech that Netanyahu gave just earlier this year, where he linked ISIS and Iran. It's totally preposterous. They're fighting each other.
Shiite, yeah.
They're fighting each other right now as we speak. The Iranians are the only people who are putting boots on the ground, and that's the only way you're going to get rid of these criminals and terrorists.
And it's the Western intelligence agencies in Israel that are backing some of the terrorist actions on Iranian soil with the Jindala. Is it Jindala and
the MEK?
MEK, yeah, MEK. Where, and there's also the Stuxnet virus and all that cyber terrorism. That's virtually admitted.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's anything. The aggressors. It's obvious who the aggressors are if you just simply look at the facts.
Yes.
But it might be because I think, as you've mentioned in some of your other talks and writings, is what Iran presents is, again, it's a cohesive, stabilized Islamic republic, and I guess the Anglo-Israeli West can't brook that type of resistance, however trivial.
No. And they've never gotten over losing Iran when the Shah fell. They've never gotten over it. So, but on the other hand, we have this moment of sanity, which is Obama trying to come to some type of agreement with Iran. I hope it comes about because it's one of the few bright spots in this recent history. And of course, the neoconservatives are always upset when there's a threat that peace might break out. They wake up in a cold sweat every night. Peace might break out.
Well, because their bread and butter is conflict.
Yes.
It's strategy of tension.
It goes right back to Trotsky. Trotsky's notion of perpetual war. That's what they want.
And they're Trotskyites.
They're Trotskyites. That's right.
Don't be surprised that Trotskyites behave like Trotskyites.
Right.
But you mentioned some of the intrigues going back into the late 70s and Kissinger. How Kissinger represented a competing bloc with the neocons who were more ideological, I think, than say more practical. Because I think Kissinger, would you describe as more or less was a Rockefeller agent?
Yes, the old the Council of Foreign Relations. Yes.
And he was more or less installed into the Nixon administration to kind of handle Nixon for the Rockefeller faction or that entity. But we come to the fall of the Shah, and there has been some speculation that whole thing of first of all bringing about the Shah's downfall has something to do with Chase Manhattan Bank, and they were over the barrel financially with the Shah, and they benefited greatly from the frozen assets.
That's right. You're absolutely right.
Can you go into that? Because to me, that's the part that a lot of Americans don't understand. For one thing, is that we're dealing with different factions. It's ideological neocon Jewish faction, the waspish Rockefeller faction, with Kissinger versus the neocons, and that's
this was David Rockefeller, and they were heavily invested in Iran. And if the Shah went down, they were going to lose a lot of money. So they were the ones. David Rockefeller is the one who, through Kissinger, who was the Rockefeller asset, persuaded Carter to let the Shah into the country, to take the Shah under their wing, and that's what precipitated the whole revolution, the hostage taking.
Now, did they have some sort of inside information that there'd be this hostage taking, and that could be a pretext for seizing Iranian assets?
No, I don't think nobody knew that the hostage taking was coming.
Okay.
Nobody knew about that. That was a totally spontaneous student operation, at least from the lady that I mentioned before, Massima.
And then they dragged it out once it was.
No, the government, the Ayatollah's government intervened, and they took the money from the George H.W. Bush, and they prolonged it for the money, and because they hated Jimmy Carter. What they were thinking, I mean, they were crazy. Because, it's like jumping from the frying pan into the fire. You think Jimmy Carter's bad, wait till George Bush and Ronald Reagan take over the White House. And that led immediately to the attack, the Iraqi attack on Iran, which there's a picture on the web of Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein. The Americans are going to send the poison gas to Saddam Hussein, which they will then use as a pretext for invading Iraq in 2003. This is total hypocrisy.
And of
You
course,
know,
that war set the stage for the Gulf War in 1991 too, because
that's right.
it was the
That's right.
war debts and yeah.
That's right. Because I think that Saddam felt that he could trust Bush, and his ambassador April Glaspie said Saddam basically floated the idea of what if we take your Kuwait, and she said, "Oh, we don't care." And then, of course, they lured him into Kuwait, and then that was the excuse to this big coalition to attack and remove Saddam Hussein. Every time they've removed a dictator, whether it's Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein or whoever, they have anarchy. And there's some people who say maybe they want anarchy. I think that's the Israelis want anarchy, but I don't think the oil companies want it. I think that the oil companies were dead set against both the overthrow of Libya and of Iraq, as far as I
Yeah.
can tell.
We have about 5, 6 more minutes, and your view on the 1978. You have the death of Pope John Paul I after 33 days in office, which I thought was an interesting number. His sudden death, and I guess the election of Pope John Paul II, and a lot of people have investigated that and thought that maybe the Pope was assassinated for him looking into the Vatican bank scandals, and this obviously involves what you mentioned earlier was this P2 Lodge and some of the intelligence agencies, because they're using the Vatican bank as a conduit to launder drug money to pay for criminal operations and black money, black ops. Do you have any you have a particular take on that or insight?
Yeah, I told you before. I got a call from Michel Sindona, a letter from Michel Sindona. He was in prison. He wanted me to come, and I was going to tell his story. And then within a week or so, he died. He was murdered, poisoned with coffee cups. So I could have been in that prison picking up that cup of coffee. I'd probably be dead now. But what the big change, as far as I can tell, came with the anti-communist crusade.
Mm-hmm.
When the Vatican Bank was being used as a conduit for money to bring down for these groups like Solidarity, and I would have to say Medjugorje was also part of the anti-communist crusade.
So the Vatican bank was kind of like BCCI.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, they were related to the BCCI, which got created after that crisis in the 70s I talked to you about. It was an obscure Pakistani bank that became the biggest money laundering operation in the world because the CIA had basically been defunded, and they needed to get involved in criminal activity like drugs so that they could continue doing what they wanted to do. And the BCCI was created to do that.
Because I read David Yalb's book on In God's Name, and he talks about Bishop Marcinkus out of Chicago, and I guess he was in charge of the Vatican Bank, and what happened was, according to him, that John Paul I was going to look into open the books and investigate it, and his belief is that contributed to his untimely demise.
I don't believe that.
You don't believe that? Okay.
Non è vero, ma bel trovato. That's what the Italians say. It's not true, but it's a great story.
Okay, just a great story. Okay.
I think that's what it was. I think that Marcinkus was involved in the funding, channeling of money into Poland for Solidarity, and I think that they were heavily involved in that. And I think that the legacy, as far as I can tell, was this inability to condemn Medjugorje, the inability to deal with Medjugorje.
That was that false apparition?
Yeah, the false apparition in Bosnia, which they are now finally going to condemn like 35 years after it started, 34 years after it started. They were incapable of doing it. And it caused real serious spiritual damage in the church. Medjugorje is a place that's infested. It's infested with evil spirits. And so people go there and they think something weird happens. And they think, it's the Blessed Mother. I must be a great person because something weird happened in my hotel room or something like that. My rosaries turned gold, blah, 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 this whole thing. It was just bad for the whole church. And I think that what happened is that they basically said, nothing's going to happen. In other words, just leave us alone. And so there was this reluctance on the part of John Paul II to say anything about it. I talked to the Bishop of Mostar, Pavel Zanic. He told me, and it was 88, he said, I met with Ratzinger. I said, it's phony. And I said, what did Ratzinger say? And Pavel Zanic said to me, he agreed with me. And then he told me, and then I met with the Pope. And I said, what did the Pope say? And he said, the Pope said nothing.
And this is because it's a kind of a cottage industry developed, right? A lot
Yeah,
of that.
huge
Yeah.
amounts of illegal money. Bosnia is a totally lawless region. For money, the Franciscans created their own bank, so they're doing involved. All these pilgrims are bringing lots of hard currency into basically Yugoslavia, which is or has a worthless currency, and they use this to fund the war,
Hmm.
the war of Croatian independence, and the Vatican and Germany. Vatican, it was either Vatican first or Germany second, or vice versa, recognized Croatia as a country. This ended dialogue with the Orthodox. They were so offended.
Yeah.
Here's Rome interfering in politics once again, and it killed ecumenism right then
Another
and there.
another bad deal made by the church. Yeah.
That's right.
Interesting.
Another bad deal because they got involved in worldly things, political alliances.
And you have a book on that, The Medjugorje Deception.
The Medjugorje Deception, which
Yeah.
I'd be happy to sell to anyone now. It's especially timely because it looks as if the Vatican is going to issue a statement condemning Medjugorje.
Okay. Well, okay, we're out of time. Listen, I want to thank you for coming back in to discuss these things. I just want to say something about your books. I have read many of them, and I've found the most powerful and thought-provoking books I've read. And they're thick, full of material, and they're also a pleasure to read.
Thank you.
Your writing is both engaging and erudite. So I just want to say I highly recommend your books. Again, it's culturewars.com.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jones, for joining me again tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.